Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Leadership Live, which is presented by Sounding Board. I am Christine Tao. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Sounding Board. We are a dynamic leader development suite that offers coaching and mentoring solutions to some of the most innovative companies. And our Leadership Live series is about hosting really dynamic leaders. And so I'm thrilled to have Al Dea join us today. Al, I met you because I got to go on your podcast. So I'm super excited to be able to have you on ours.
I'm happy to be here. It's always great chatting with you, Christine. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Amazing. Well, Al, you have been doing an incredible amount of work as a consultant in the leadership and talent space. And that's actually where we kind of mind melded around a lot of our philosophies around the future of work, how to think about leadership development. But before we get to all of that, and I know you have some great, stories and insights to share, I want to know a little bit more about you. So, first question we always start here is what is your origin story?
Sure, happy to share. So my origin story, which I think we were just talking, you might appreciate, starts in upstate New York. I was born in Rochester, New York. I know your husband is from upstate New York, but born and raised in Rochester, New York. And that's where I grew up. And growing up for me was all about being on teams, being a part of teams, leading teams. I played sports. I played basketball. That was my favorite sport. For those who follow basketball, I was the point guard. So it was my job, even though I was the littlest guy on the court, to call the plays, to kind of translate what the coach wanted, to encourage other people, to support them. And while I never really had a great or a career in basketball, a lot of those lessons, kind of being a leader in that context, translated over to other areas and other things. I got a chance to take my first management job when I was 13 years old. I
What?
worked at a golf course. Yeah, I was in charge of managing all of the other caddies in the caddy program I was at. And that would eventually lead on to other things. I was in student government when I was in college, became the first ever Asian American student body president at my alma mater, Boston College. But I think more than anything, I have always been someone who had people around me who believed in what I could do and wanted to bring out the best in me. And I just think it is really a privilege to be in a position where you can bring out the best in other people to achieve something great. And that is what has always motivated me and inspired me to do the work that I do. I just have always believed in the power of people. And when you can set conditions or inspire people to bring out their best self, you can do a heck of a lot of fun stuff. So that's a little bit about me and my origin story.
Well, I love that you have sports as part of that. I'm a big sports fanatic myself. Not basketball, but I play volleyball and I play pickleball, and have always felt that sports, especially team sports, are such a great lesson and a platform for learning a lot of the critical dynamics that I see now in leading my own company or having worked in teams.
Yeah, absolutely. So many lessons from there.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe tell us a little bit then about how that brought you into the world of leadership, because you didn't go there right away, right? You've spent time actually across functions like
Mhm.
product marketing,
Sure.
more traditional consulting, and you've done that with some really great companies like Salesforce and Deloitte. And now you're working with a lot of companies of that size and stature to help them with their organizational strategies. Like, how did that leap happen?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess, would say for the majority of my career, I've kind of been at the intersection of change and leadership. And that spanned across IT, it spanned across marketing, it spanned across HR. And I think what really it all comes back to is that in all the work I was doing, whether it was working in the professional services realm of working with clients to undergo digital transformation or
Yeah.
business transformation, or working inside of a company who was going through that themselves. I've kind of always been at kind of the intersection of change and leadership. And I think one of the things that I always found in everything that the work I was doing was that everything, regardless of what you were trying to do or change, like always came back to, I guess, one of a couple of things. One was, do we have the right people in the room? Two was, do we have the right conditions that are set? And the third was, do we have role modeling from people who are enabling both of those things to happen? And so the more I kind of got into and realizing that, the more I started to realize, while at the time I was maybe working functionally in broadly in human capital or broadly in IT, what I really was in the business of talent and people, right? And so one of the, I guess, hallmarks for me was just getting a chance to work hand in hand a lot of times with some companies who were at the time trying to go through some major transformations and changes to their business in terms of how they interact with customers. And while a lot of the work that was being done was thinking about new technologies and how they were going to use them, anyone who's ever worked really in the trenches with technology knows that any type of technology change, yes, that change is important, but really at the underpinning of it is people and their ability to change, their willingness to change, the conditions they have set for them so that they can adopt those new technologies. And a lot of that always comes back to leadership. And so the more I realized that, the more I tried to go down that path and really getting to the root of some of those things so that the companies I was working with could, change. And then a number of other things, kind of happened along the way. But the short of it is that eventually I just decided that, while I loved kind of working on some of those big, hairy, transformational kind of works with organizations, what I really cared most about was kind of going back to what we were talking about in the beginning of my origin story.
Yeah.
How do we put people in positions to reach their fullest potential so that they can perform at a high level? And so that's what motivates me to do the work that I do each day now.
Amazing. And we will definitely talk a little bit about some of that work that you've done. But I think one of the things you said really struck me. I just did a webinar yesterday with Rebecca Stern from Udemy, and the topic of digital transformation was a core one for us. And of course, Gen AI at the heart of that today, which many companies are facing. And so we talked about the same idea that trillions of dollars being spent on digital transformation projects, and yet the stats around the success of those, the sustainability of those, the impact of those is, I'd say, mixed, right? 70% of them failing to actually realize the potential that they were expected to have. And we landed on a similar note, which was, ultimately it's people that are driving these changes, and that oftentimes, and McKinsey research backs this, it's the mindset and people changes and behavior changes that can have a multiplier effect on the success of those projects. But the thing I want to ask you about is, you named those, right? You named people and context, but I think you named something I hadn't heard before, which was the role modeling of that. Tell me more, or tell us more about what that is.
Yeah, sure. Well, this often comes up a lot in the context of culture and organizational culture. Everyone has their own definitions, but one of the ones I love best is what Seth Godin, the author, often says, where he says culture is people like us do things like this. And the general idea behind culture, right, when in context with role modeling, is that when individuals see a certain thing that is being done in an organization, and particularly from a leader who has positional power and formal power and formal authority, when they see it, it makes them more aware and cognizant that they could do that too. And particularly if that behavior that the leaders does ends up being something that is rewarded, right? There's so many other contexts that also applies to, whether that's I don't know if for anyone who's watching, I presume if you have kids, right? That certainly comes into play as well, and certainly in other aspects as well. But this idea, though, for anything that you're trying to do, particularly within the context of change, if you're a leader and the actions that you're taking don't actually align with the changes you're trying to make, or for that matter, the values of your organization, it's just going to be a really hard sell to get other people on board and around you. And so, and I think in so much of the work that I was doing prior to this, what made or break a lot of the willingness to change in a lot of cases, or the ability to drive that change, really did come back to what were the leaders doing? Were they actually aligning those actions with the values that they stated, or with the change that they wanted to make? Because, in some cases, change can be a lot for some people, particularly in certain contexts. And if you have a leader who is telling you one thing but is doing another, I think it just makes it really, really hard for people to want to get on board with that. And so I think that's what ultimately comes back with role modeling. And I think I think that the kind of recommendation or the action then for leaders is that it really is going back to that quote, the famous quote of be the change that you want to see, and with emphasis on the be and the act, because words are important, but they only get you so far. If you actually want to see it, you actually have to act into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's it feels so logical, doesn't it, Al?
It does.
And
It does. Yeah.
and yet all of us have either experienced it, struggled
Yeah.
with it ourselves, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Or seen how that dissonance
Sure.
of what you say and what you do and the role modeling from leaders really has such an outsized impact.
Absolutely. And it's the classic say do gap, right? There is, for a lot of things, there's just always that gap between, even if we conceptually know something or we believe in it or agree that it's a good thing, sometimes it's just hard to take that action. Ask anyone who's tried to eat healthier or try to go to the gym, right? It's like you can believe it to be true, but sometimes it's always hard to live up to that. And some of that is human nature. But to your point, some of that can be influenced positively when leaders take the lead and role model that for others.
Well, I'm guessing that that likely is a theme that you bring into the work that you do with your clients. And it certainly sounds like, based on a lot of the thought leadership you put out there, that it's a thread that influences how you think about how companies can really drive successful programs. So, could you share just a bit more at a high level, like, what is it that you are trying to help companies enact, and what's the vision behind that for yourself and for the companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, fundamentally, right, the role of a business, if we're really going back to the very, very like early stages, is to, I think Drucker said, the role of a business is to get a customer and then to keep it, right? That's fundamentally what like when it comes down
So
to it.
good. So good.
Like brass tacks, like that's what we do like each day. There's obviously other things that come with that, but like that's fundamentally what it's all about. And I think part of the work that I do is just really thinking about, if we know that to be true, given the state of the world today, what do we also need to, in order so that we can continue to do that amidst all of the things that are happening in changing in the world of work that is today. And so I think part of what motivates me to do the work that I do, and where I think I see where I align really well with some of the clients that I work with, is that, like, yes, like fundamentally what that ultimately comes back to is tactically some kind of leadership program or some kind of talent development program or some kind of org development type of program. But conceptually, any type of thing that we're doing is making sure that people have the right idea about the behaviors they need to be doing in order to be successful in that ultimate pursuit of getting a customer or keeping it, right? And as things like technology have evolved the way that we work, as where we work has evolved, as we continue to have industries and markets kind of go through ups and downs, we every now and then have to think and look up and see and understand, for the changes that are coming in and happening to us, how do we want to respond? And certainly there are ways in which we need to make strategic decisions around that, or things that leaders need to do. But that also, what then trickles down to, is that for every person in that organization, they have to now act and do something in a certain way. And that's where some of the work I do like comes into play. How do we make sure people are aware of that? How do we make sure people have the capacity to do that? How do we make sure that there are conditions that are there for them to do that? And so that's when you start getting into, leadership development or talent development programs or learning interventions and things like that. And so, but for me at least, and maybe this is just because I've always just been curious about business. Like when you start about business and just bring it back to brass tacks, get a customer, keep it. And so that's really what it is for me, is just figuring out, in the context of the world of work, how do we do that? And then how do we support that through our people?
Well, I think it's how do I say? I think it's something that a lot of folks in the L&D function strive for, right?
Mhm.
Other ways you might describe that is what's the ROI or the impact of the programs that you're driving. And I think for a lot of organizations and even some of the leaders, it's felt like a hop, skip, jump type of
Yes.
connection. And I'm
Yes.
curious if there's anything very specific or
Yeah.
tangible you could offer to help people understand how you do that.
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. I've actually been thinking about this question a lot. So you're going to get some new ideas, and you can definitely give me your thoughts and perspectives, particularly because I know you talk with leaders about this each and every
Yeah.
day. So I think there's first off, a couple things that are happening. So number one, many of us work in organizations that are incredibly good at figuring out what is the task I need to do and then to do it, right?
Yes.
And what ends up happening, I think, a lot of times, is that we get so laser focused on doing that thing, that task, that project, that deliverable, that we miss what that thing translates into or what the impact of it is, right? And so that's where sometimes we get stuck sometimes in L&D, but many other functions, particularly enabling functions, get stuck where they're doing all these things, but maybe their stakeholders don't see it or don't understand it, right? And I think a lot of times it's very easy to kind of equate like action with progress when the two of those are not the same. So part of it is the doing thing. The other challenge I think sometimes we have, particularly again, if you're in an area that is enabling in an organization, is that we often speak in our own language, which may or may not be the same language that our other stakeholders that we support understand. And so there is a translation layer that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. You and I and all of our counterparts in L&D could talk about the Kirkpatrick model till the cows come in, and we probably have a lot of fun doing that. I know that not everyone likes to think about that, right? Other departments have their own language too, and so I think sometimes we use good principles, we use good reasoning, but it doesn't always resonate with the audience that we have, and so we get lost in terms of being able to have that translation layer to make sure that we're still keeping the spirit of what we're doing, but we're saying it in words that people want to hear and that resonate with them. So I think what ultimately this kind of amounts to, and I think what it maps back to, is that fundamentally, I think it's really hard today to have a really good business strategy without thinking about the talent strategy that goes with it.
Right.
Like talent, your headcount is one of the biggest, it's going to be one of the biggest line items in any company, right? And so how are you going to figure out for that strategy that you have either the value creation that's going to come from that talent, or the efficiency that's going to happen, or the productivity that's going to happen, from that talent. And I think when we start from there as the starting point and really trying to make sure that we're linking how our people enable the success of our business strategy, which best serves our customer, I think that's a better place to start than, and yes, all the other things matter from what we know from science and rigor and all that stuff. But I think we have to start and ground ourselves in the reality that talent enables the business strategy. And if we can have that conversation to start, I think it can get us to a better place.
So if I had to summarize, is it a bit of a lens that you want people to put around how they even approach designing models, and then also maybe actually a different way of talking about the impact of those, which is great. You can use the measurement and Kirkpatrick models and all of that to back up the rigor.
Yeah.
But don't forget that that's ultimately not what is actually going to resonate with the stakeholders across your org.
Yes, I think you summarized it very well. And I would say that what informs that thinking is two things. One, going back to some of the change and transformation work that I've done in the past, I've seen a lot of work go well when we did that, and I've seen a lot of work miss the mark when we didn't do that, right? In terms of really being able to approach in the right way. The other lens that I think about this often is that, wouldn't we want to do the same for our customers? Wouldn't we want to talk in their language? Wouldn't we want to ground in things that they know and understand, and not make our org chart their lived reality? We would want to do the same for them, I think. And so I think we can use some of that mindset in terms of how we're thinking about what we're doing. I think many of us are doing the right things. I think we just need to, maybe perhaps to your point, just have a little bit of a different lens and approach, have a little bit more empathy. I know that word gets overused a lot, but truly trying to understand from the perspective of the other, and then backing into how we communicate that and how we do that work.
Okay, well, I'm going to put you on the spot, which is, you said you had an example of, places where you've used that approach and that worked well, and places where you haven't.
Sure.
Anything you can share about that so people go, oh, I see how that's different?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of my very first business transformation projects that I worked on, one of the things that I had to do was, we were doing a call center transformation and a sales transformation. So putting in new systems for their customer support reps and their sales reps. And so one of the things that we had to do was we had to go out with the sales reps and spend time with them in the field. Just classic, straight up classic out of I'm assuming someone's MBA textbook of literal management by walking around. And I remember being in a car, with a truck, with a sales rep who was driving around and talking to me about his day, what he was doing, how he was going through the day, how he was doing things. And that was it was a meaningful moment for me for a couple of reasons. Like, I think number one, I think I was 22 or 23. And so it made me realize just like how different his work was than like the work that I was mostly kind of doing with folks up in corporate, which is not unreasonable thing sometimes people encounter in those environments. Yeah. But number two, that experience is something I've always taken with me in all the roles that I've had with the stakeholders that I've had to serve, in terms of how do I actually make sure that I'm understanding of their work context before like we do anything. Because I can come in with the best models and the best ideas. I can come in with the best strategy. I can come in with the newest and shiniest like toy. But unless I actually understand where they're coming from and what they do, I think it's probably not going to be nearly as effective. And so like what that ultimately translates into, and I will give an example. So I think one of the projects that I most remember where this really came to light was when and really, this was a project that really changed the trajectory of my careers. I was working for a consulting firm at the time, and we ended up building a leadership development model and I guess almost like program playbook, if you will, for a large company that was a holding company that had a lot of portfolio companies within it. And most of their portfolio companies had nothing and when it came to any of the stuff for a multitude of different reasons. And so really using that approach again of like really doing, in our parlance, needs analysis, right? And doing it effectively. And really, the unique thing was the businesses were so different and diverse. Like we really had to get pretty nuanced and understanding of, hey, like this is your context for your industry. This is the context for your culture across many different portfolio companies. But that kind of mindset really, I think, helped us in terms of coming up with a model that they could start with at the top level of the holding company of like, hey, this is what we think we would like to do. And then being able to then kind of customize it a little bit for each of the portfolio companies within. But I think what made us successful in terms of some of the outcomes we were able to hit in terms of getting it off the ground and some of the succession of some of the leaders who went through it really came from that initial kind of upfront heavy lifting work we did to understand what is that lived experience for those people in that company? What does leadership look like? What does that mean right now? And then using that to kind of both have something broad enough that worked across, but then nuanced and specific enough to each of those companies.
Very interesting. And it felt like, obviously a core business strategy for that company, given that it was a holding company, would be something that has to work in a portfolio approach, I'm assuming. So is that one of the ties that you brought into the design?
Sure. Yes. No, absolutely. And the tricky thing with those things, right, is that everyone is their own unique circumstance, right? In terms of every culture is different. People are complex. And so there's a little bit of a complexity that comes with, company to company. But, because of the nature of the business and the nature of the dynamics of the holding company, we had to kind of find a way to kind of provide, I guess you could almost call it like freedom within a framework, right? Of having something that was broad, but also, giving that personalization and that customization that it needed at each of the individual company levels. And so, there's a lot of nuance in it for sure. But that's also why like being able to get to that nuance like really does come back to really making sure that like you are understanding that context for those people, right? And that's true for whether it is a leadership development model and program model for a portfolio, a holding company and their portfolio companies, or for any type of program that you're thinking about inside of your own organization, right? And the stakeholders that you're trying to support. The better you understand that context that they're in, what their work is like, what their challenges are, what their business looks like each day, like the better off you're going to probably be in terms of really getting buy-in, as well as like making sure that what you produce is something that actually is engaging and useful and helps them, with what they need to be helped with, for that specific program.
Where did you have to draw the boundaries? Was it at leader level? Was it around the types of skill sets? And then where did you have to bring in that flexibility?
So it was a little bit for stuff like behaviors and things. It was more about giving a playbook for here's the framework for how we go figure this out. And then we actually did do work. We did the workshops to at least get started in terms of helping them get off the ground in terms of activating around that, right?
Yep.
Because that is ultimately where some of the uniqueness really like comes out and comes to life. And I mean, definitely similarities for sure, across, but in particular, one company A and company B, particularly if they have different leaders and different cultures, well, what you're going to expect out of the behaviors is probably going to be like different. But yeah, we had to, that's kind of, again, where like, all right, well, like we have a framework for how we come up with this, how we try to find the uniqueness within your company. And we have some parameters about how you can do this. And in many cases, we ended up kind of collaborating with many of the companies on this, but it started, that's kind of where you really get very precise, company to company. But that initial kind of container, if you will, was what was like the standard approach.
I'm hearing this often as a theme. And, I mentioned earlier, I'd done a webinar yesterday, and Rebecca Stern, she's the head of organizational development at Udemy, and they decided that their container was going to be around skills. And so the flexibility they built into the program was the ability to bring different skills into the programs as they, as an organization, started to understand which skills were going to be the most critical to help them drive their business strategy. So I think you certainly are hitting on a theme that we see a lot of companies approaching, which is how do you design for a more modular, flexible approach to programs versus a very, I'd say, linear or specific outcome.
I had a similar conversation the other day with a round table of talent and learning leadership leaders about this same topic.
Oh, great.
So I think it's definitely something people are thinking about. And, there's always the complexity of managing both like scale with, the nuance, right? And
that's right. That's right.
And yeah, so it's definitely top of mind, I think, for a lot of leaders.
Well, Al, we've just got a few more minutes left. And, given the fact that you've worked with a lot of different types of companies and also different types of solutions, whether it's around transformation or maybe more traditional leader programs, I'd love to see if you have any sort of parting thoughts or advice that you have for folks out there. You don't have to give away all of your goods, and all of your insights that you do with your clients, but I know people would love some takeaways. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have two things I think a lot about for anyone, but I think apply to our audience here: relevancy and expertise. I think those two things are really, really important. Relevancy in the context of, as the world of work continues to change, how do we make sure as learning, talent, leadership professionals that we are aware of what is relevant, both for us as well as for our business, right? And I think that is an invitation for us to be a part of the conversation about how we can not only do we know what's relevant, but also how we can make sure that we are included in that conversation to keep the company relevant as things evolve. So I think anything you can do to do that, to be focused on that, whatever you have to do that, I think that's like the first thing. And then on the expertise thing, this is something that I've always kind of believed as like a life model, but I mean, even in a world with technology and things that can, create some pretty good expertise, I still think earned insight and expertise still matters. And I think it matters even more in the sense of that having an understanding of what is true or what could be true, in a world where there's a lot of information, I think having that earned insight and expertise can really make an impact. And particularly when you can combine the relevancy with like expertise, that's going to enable you to really be able to be a leader, I think, for the change that you're trying to create. Because, regardless of what type of program you're running, like many of us are, enacting a change of some kind, whether that is a change in behavior or a change in the way that business is being done. So if you can focus on those two things, I think you'll be in a really good position.
Well, I think that would resonate with a lot of folks. And I love that message of, hey, all of you out there have earned expertise, right? And bring that to your programs and have confidence in what you've learned in delivering these at scale. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for the time, Al. It was such a pleasure, and hopefully we will do this again soon.
sounds great. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.